I heard myself asking her for one day more, one last day together, and then I would set her free. My muse's acceptance of the deal seemed to take forever. This offer was either an act of love or an act of desperation from my character, and I still have no idea which. And, more importantly back then, I had no idea of how I was supposed to deliver on that promise. Hello, my name is Simon Brind, and I am at the time of recording this a LARPer, LARP designer, academic and writer. I've been involved with this form for long enough that I'm not absolutely clear on my origin story or quite how long I've been doing this, but it's somewhere around the 40-year mark. I come from the UK LARP tradition, but these days I would associate myself more closely with Nordic LARP. The distinction between these two traditions is one of design approaches and of play style. I have enjoyed both. I recognise many of the other speakers on the programme come from different traditions and backgrounds. To some of the folks attending this symposium, I must offer a long overdue apology for the sudden and permanent disappearance of members of their in-game factions. For others, I make no apology, as I have wept with them or over them in the corner of some far-flung castle while we waited together for the end. I'm a part of Avalon LARP Studio, an international not-for-profit collective. As an academic, my interests are in modes of performance and how we interrogate the story of a LARP during runtime. I'm going to build on those ideas today because I want to challenge some of them, some of the ideas that we have about emergent narrative. My brief for this talk was to act as a keynote and as a provocation, to help set the tone and to kickstart some discussions. In this talk, I'm going to examine the relationship between liveness, player agency, and emergent narratives in LARP. Rather than viewing emergent narrative as something that genuinely unfolds organically, I'm going to suggest that it is informed by power knowledge regimes embodied within the structural design of the game and from society at large, so that despite being shaped by embodied role-play and immersion, what often appears to be spontaneity is actually constrained by a disciplinary mechanism. And this normalizes or privileges particular story forms while marginalizing others. But let's think about it like this. The game and the plot makes us do things. Or more specifically, the structure and design of these things significantly affects the story that is told. I'm going to start with some definitions because I don't think there's necessarily a consistent terminology among LARP scholars and practitioners. And then I'll move on to talking about spontaneity and emergence. LARP is a big machine. The machine makes stories. You feed raw materials in one end, players, plot, and characters. You crank the handle, and a mince of stories and experiences come out. Emotions are discharged into the rivers, people bleed, memes are posted on socials. The machine is not perfect. When the handle stops turning, narrative remains. The process of the creation of a LARP contains some semblance of plot, in the sense of plotting. The play of the LARP generates the story, and the documentation or recounting of the events of the LARP after the fact is the narrative. The story world is the temporary fictional reality of an immersive event, the diegesis, as distinct from the life world, which is where we spend the rest of our time. This connects back to the idea of plot. The story world is a design space, and when we do world building, we define the fiction's physical reality, its history, cultures, and its metaphysics. This is something that the late Elgar Larsson suggested had the potential to be a radical act. He said, where we define the rules of reality, we are actually saying no to the powers that be. But whilst designers can choose to define and to unequivocally describe those rules in radical new ways, they often don't. I will come back to this. I maintain that for LARPers, immersion is a participatory act. A LARPer's suspension of disbelief is an active adoption of the belief in the reality of the story world and the people and the characters within it. In its simplest form, agency describes the ability of a participant to materially affect the events of the story world because of something their character does or chooses not to do. It is what seems to enable emergence because it is a proof of liveness. Without agency, without what Harry Harold calls levers to pull, the story is a known entity. There is only the illusion of liveness. Now, one of the pieces of received wisdom about LARP, internationally as well in the UK, is that plot never survives first contact with the players. In VR terms, Luchard and Aylett describe this as a narrative paradox, the conflict between pre-authored narrative structures, plot, and the illusion of freedom in the virtual environment. Plot never survives first contact with the players. Now, what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is to invite you all to question this orthodoxy. I am a combat narratologist. Narratology is the study of narrative and narrative structures and the ways that these affect human perception. And combat narratology extends this field to allow the study of a real-time, multi-threaded, participatory story-making machine, whilst acknowledging the metaleptic unreliability of the narrative crossing from the story world to the life world. I think that the critical study of a LARP has to happen from within, as a participant. If I stand on the edge of your game with a clipboard taking field notes as an off-game presence, I won't really understand what's going on, and I will affect the experience of the players. The act of observation changes the outcome. But paradoxically, it's extremely difficult to objectively and critically observe a LARP from within because of immersion, because of the bleedy agency and alibi that comes from the character. So the very things that allow us to play a LARP get in the way of studying it. This idea of metaleptic unreliability derives from the confusion about who is delivering the narrative, whether they are inside the story at that moment, and who is speaking. Is it the player or is it the character? And from the intrinsic subjectivity of the story as experienced by the individual. So my opening statement from this talk, some field notes taken immediately after the LARP Helicon, is an example of this. It switches between first and third person, and even the researcher is unclear whose voice he is writing in. The term emergent narrative, as coined by Aylett, refers to a form of interactive storytelling where the narrative is built bottom up from interactions of characters. There is no primary human author, and the story is unknown at the start. So I have somewhat sweepingly declared in my title for this talk that emergent narrative is a myth. But let me take a moment to describe the places where something that we might think of emergence does exist, and then I'll explain why it doesn't. Micro-level player decisions and interactions. So individual player interactions can create unplanned moments of tension, cooperation, or betrayal that shift the direction of their subjective stories. Unpredictable player behaviors. Yeah, players bring personal interpretations to their roles, and sometimes this subverts implied themes or breaks expected patterns in ways that the designer might not have foreseen, or which other players might not have expected. What I started to see by looking at emergent stories and LARPs was a tendency for participants to collectively follow well understood patterns, habituated tropes, formulaic arcs, etc. So the narrative system of a LARP is chaotic, but inside of a chaotic system, we can often find a kind of order. Essentially, it is possible to infer the objective direction of an emergent story if we understand its inherent structure. And if that is the case, then I suggest that it's not as spontaneous as we might think it is. Initially, I put this down to players following cultural narratives and well understood story patterns that stood as subliminal signposts. A bit like Pratchett's Witches. Once you're inside a story, you get trapped and you have to follow it to the end. So LARP stories seem to produce unexpected or unplotted developments on a personal level, but these are still affected by the structure of the LARP, or sometimes a misinterpretation of the design. They are still a part of the pattern. So what I want us to think about is whether designers should acknowledge and embrace their role in shaping narrative structures rather than perpetuating an illusion of pure emergence. So I agree the concept of emergent narrative and LARP can be both valid and misleading, depending on how we define emergence and how much control is exerted by the designer. If we think of a truly emergent narrative as one that arises spontaneously, independent of imposed structures, and due to the liveliness of the form in real time, then LARP rarely achieves pure emergence because the design, the rules, the setting, and the mechanics inherently shape the possibilities of storytelling. I've tentatively alluded to Foucault's ideas about power knowledge. The argument is that knowledge is not just a reflection of reality, but a tool of power. Knowledge shapes how we understand the world and influences our behavior within it. In addition, power is not just exerted through laws or rules, but operates through institutionalized behavior, discourse, social norms. This also applies to events within the story world as microcosm. In many ways, as a designed reality, it's perhaps easier to understand how these ideas may apply. In addition, our design story forms act as regimes of truth, accepted ways of thinking narratively that reinforce authority and control. Simply put, the LARP designer asserts power over their players, deliberately or otherwise. This control isn't just explicit, rules, mechanics, and setting, but also implicit, social dynamics, narrative framing, and expectations, and to a certain extent, subliminal, the narrative structures and cultural narratives. And this asserting of power is happening metaleptically between both the story world and the life world. LARPs can be a powerful tool for interrogating real-world power structures, but if designers lean into traditional hierarchies, reinforce marginalization, or present dominant ideologies without critique, they risk replicating real-world inequalities rather than challenging them. These are some ways that designers assert power over players. So, control over truth. The designer decides which histories, ideologies, or worldviews are embedded in their game. Players must navigate within that framework, meaning their understanding of the world is always filtered, if not necessarily viewed, through the creator's lens. Rule enforcement and constraint. Mechanics determine what players can and cannot do, or what their characters can and cannot do, whether through in-game laws, skill systems, relationships, or enforced hierarchies. These structures dictate choices and constrain alternative approaches, just as societal norms constrain behavior in the life world. Information asymmetry. Some characters might be given more knowledge than others. By limiting what individuals know, the designer can shape interactions, encourage conflicts, and create dependencies, which is great for play, but it also mirrors how life world institutions regulate access to information in society. Normalization. Even in player-driven games, there is still a social contract. Here we understand that the shared values about what is acceptable diegetic behavior and extra-diegetic behavior. This can be described through meta rules, implicit expectations, or rewards for following narrative conventions. Over time, players internalize these rules, regulating themselves, just as Foucault describes in Disciplinary Power. Pre-designed stories and archetypes. By creating roles, factions, and story arcs, designers implicitly shape how players perceive their place within the world, or their character's place within the world. So even in open-ended LARPs, the framing of the experience can reinforce existing power structures. For example, noble versus peasant, law versus rebellion, good versus evil. In the UK tradition, we don't have the same degree of control simply because the norm is for players to create their own characters rather than to play characters written for them by the designers. However, our players are not innocent. Even when creating their own character, a LARPer can internalize the game's rules and setting to a surprising extent, often shaping their behavior and thought processes even beyond the story world. So here the players regulate themselves and one another based on ingrained structures, whether societal or in this case diegetic and mechanical. When we consider also the idea of herd competence, that these structures are understood and propagated by a majority of players, this ceases to be about an individual internalizing structure and becomes about cultural or institutional behavior amongst a group of players. So, how do players internalize rules in LARP? Well, here are a few examples. Behavioral conditioning through mechanics. Repeated exposure to similar rule systems can lead players to instinctively follow these structures, even when their characters might have room to subvert them. self-policing and social norms. In the same way real-world institutions encourage conformity, LARP communities often create unspoken and indeed sometimes spoken expectations. Players may self-regulate, avoiding actions outside predefined narratives or rules, even when no direct enforcement for these exists. And I'm not putting a value judgment on this. I think social norms and social contracts are a good thing. Language and identity framing. As I said before, the way a LARP defines its roles, noble versus peasant, mage versus warrior, influences self-perception. A player may begin to view their own capacities through the lens of the game's predefined categories, which can restrict imaginative freedom in subtle ways. And it is this imaginative freedom that should be creating the emergent story. Post-LARP effects and bleed. In highly immersive experiences, players can temporarily or even permanently adopt behavioral traits from their characters, carrying those thought patterns into the real world. Deep role-playing might cause players to emotionally internalize diegetic power structures. They might start thinking within the framework imposed by the game, accepting hierarchies or constraints as natural, much like individuals in real-world power systems. So a LARP designer could encourage players to question and challenge imposed systems rather than simply internalize them. We know that some techniques like knowledge asymmetry, hidden mechanics, or even in-game resistance movements can provoke reflection on the ways that power operates, both inside and outside the game. But LARP designers are prone to internalize dramaturgical conventions to varying degrees, and their own creative processes are shaped by their cultural norms, their narrative traditions, and I suppose by established design traditions as well. So I want to step away from the theory for a moment and illustrate these conventions with an exercise. So let me show you some character names and invite you to think for a moment about the structure of the game and the stories that are likely to emerge from each of these three examples. Here's the first one. Okay, and here is another one. And finally, now, the names on this third slide are probably less familiar to many of you, deliberately so. If you're unfamiliar with Finnish culture or these characters from Finnish mythology, you can't internalize the structures of the culture or the story. Now, I'm not saying that we should adopt the stories and experience of others, far from it, but rather that we should be aware of them. If we play in a space where no one has preconceptions, we end up following known patterns. If we play in a space where there are differing preconceptions or different levels of understanding conventions, then we're more likely to have dissonance. The final piece of this puzzle then is this tendency of designers to internalize dramaturgical conventions. This internalization can influence everything from the way they structure player interactions to the themes that they explore. My suspicion is that it's rarely a deliberate or a conscious act, and where designers do think about this, the output tends to be experimental. So we have inherited storytelling structures. Many LARP narratives borrow from theatrical or literary traditions, using familiar arcs like the hero's journey, three-act structure, fantasy tropes, faction-based conflicts, and designers may replicate these structures rather than challenge or change them. The terrifying authority of genre conventions, fantasy, dystopian, and historical LARPs often follow expectations set by broader media traditions. A medieval LARP, for example, may or perhaps even should reinforce feudal power structures because they feel authentic. But sometimes alternative interpretations could open new possibilities. Embedded pacing norms. Just as in theatre, designers may shape play around expectations of dramatic tension, climatic moments, and character development. This emphasis on structured progression probably reinforces the subliminal narrative patterns that players understand. And control over narrative power. A few designers operate with an implicit belief that they should guide the experience, shaping key plot points and limiting player agency. This mirrors traditional dramaturgical control in stage performance, where a director steers the overall vision. These designers tend to consider any deviation from their planned plot as some sort of disaster to be managed. This is something I've previously described as narrative crisis. I want to end with a work in progress model that summarizes the complexity of the problem of ludoxical hegemony. So we have this x-axis, designer control versus player agency. One end represents higher designer control, more pre-plotting, fixed roles, fixed events. The other represents player agency, perhaps a sandbox, player-originated characters, open-ended story, for example. This next axis, explicit structures versus implicit structures. One end represents overt rules, mechanics, and stated world lore, and the other has more subliminal cultural narratives, genre conventions, and internalized dramaturgical biases. And the Z-axis is about the story world immersion versus life world influence. So one end represents a deep immersion of character and actions within the diegetic reality, and the other represents a bleedy mix of real world social norms and power structures, the influence of player as person over character. Now, we can't plot a single point on this cube because the person interacting with the model is either the player or their character or the player narrativizing the actions of the character. So I'm using this matryoshka doll image to represent that. Um, it is quite complex. A puzzle, in fact. So each of the 8 smaller cubes, the octants, would then represent a specific combination of the 3 axes. The emergent narrative isn't a single point, but a dynamic space within that cube, shaped by its position along the axis, as perceived or experienced by our player, character, narrator, or PCN. For example, the octant where there's high designer control, explicit structures, and strong story world immersion might produce a highly normalized, preordained narrative if the PCN understands the dramatic conventions of the story world. Conversely, an octant with high player agency, implicit structures, and strong life world influences might lead to unpredictable, potentially dissonant, or even allow for more marginalized narratives to emerge, again, depending on the life world experiences of the PCN. But the problem with all of this, the underlying issue, it has nothing to do with whether emergent stories originate from pure spontaneity, but rather that there are some stories that are not being told. There are some people's stories that are not able to emerge because of the power knowledge regimes that constrain them. The beautiful lie of spontaneity can only become a beautiful truth if we as designers and organizers and academics and referees and thinkers and LARPers work to dismantle them. This is what agency is for. If immersion is an active verb, a process that requires effort from the participant, then this must be too. Thank you.